At one point, being close to this man became a status symbol among Turkey's elites, especially as his operation began to market itself to Western audience as a kind of free-thinking modern image of Islam. He was surrounded by Versace and Louis Vuitton clad women who rivaled Hollywood actresses and supermodels. The spectacle projected by this man was glamour, confidence, and choice. But access to that kind of world came with a lot of conditions. The women were expected to look the same, dress the same, and center their lives around a single man who dominated the space around them entirely. Behind that polished exterior, some followers reportedly began telling their friends about pressure to get money from their family just to maintain their proximity to this man. What appeared from the outside as freedom and privilege slowly revealed itself as something entirely different. Today we're unpacking the story of Adnan Oktar, a man who built one of the most bizarre, media savvy, and deeply disturbing cults in modern Islamic history. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. I'm a professor and lawyer.
And I'm Sam.
If this is your first time, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. Here we learn the law through true crime. We're available on all podcasting platforms, including YouTube, of course, on Apple, all sorts of things. And by the way, we tell stories not only in English, but now in Hindi as well. So look forward to about 60 episodes that have already been recorded. Okay, so without further ado, let's start with the story of Adnan Oktar. To understand how someone like Adnan Oktar was even possible, it helps to understand the country that produced him. So let's take a short history lesson on modern Turkey. By the way, I didn't know before, starting researching on these episodes that modern Turkey and their secular history is extremely interesting. So modern Turkey was founded on an aggressively secular platform. And Turkish secularism was never meant to be this kind of secularism that we see reflected in the West. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's new republic abolished the caliphate in 1924 and created the State Directorate of Religious Affairs, which is also known as Diyanet. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And please forgive me if you are someone who speaks Turkish and my Turkish is just completely crap. Anyway, so moving forward, the same year, in the year 1924, what Ataturk did was he closed all Sufi lounges, all religious and spiritual orders in the 1920s. And his objective was not the American idea of building a high wall between religion and state. The Turkish model of secularism was much more interventionist. The state attempted to regulate, supervise, and even reshape Islam itself. The Directorate of Religious Affairs in the 1920s onwards became an institution through which this secular state was supposed to administer all sorts of Sunni religious life. So religious orders and independent Islamic communities were actually completely restricted starting in the 1920s so that the state and the country could become completely secular. Networks known broadly as tarikats, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and simats survived the repression of the early era of secularism, and they gradually re-emerged in small ways in different parts of the country. But more or less, people tried not to show their Islamic identity in public because they had learned to exist as very modern, Western-looking people on the outside. Some of them harbored this basically resentment that they wanted to show their Islamic identity outside as well, but the state did not allow them to, and that's always been something that's been a problem in Turkey. So people learn to exist on the outside, with the formal state institution. However, many operated with a personal relationship with charitable institutions. They read publications about Islam, student networks and businesses, and even educational institutions tried to keep a part of Islam with themselves, although the state discouraged them to do so. scholars of contemporary Turkey describe precisely this peculiar sort of situation in Turkey, a state that sought to control religion while unofficially also allowing religious communities to embed itself in society. So the second part of the story is extraordinarily important because Turkey's history has actually had a lot of political violence as well, and that will become really important for the person who's going to emerge out of all this. So political violence, as I said, was very prominent in the 1960s, especially in the 70s. Turkey was intensely polarized between the radical left, which were people were very, very Marxist, and the national right. The Islamists and other fractions of society, regularly these people conflicted, the left and the right, and there was violence on the streets, there were assassinations, there was political instability, which became extremely widespread all over Turkey. The military had already intervened in politics in 1960, then again in 1971, and by the time it was 1979 and 1980, it seized power in a coup. This matters particularly, as I said earlier, because the cult leader that we're going to talk about was really taking shape in these early years. And when we come to Adnan Oktar, who's our leader, the cult leader that we're going to talk about, he actually moved to Istanbul from his native place in 1979. In other words, he began to construct his religious identity because of all these right-wing forces that he was looking at, and he was looking at everyone thinking, well, this is not good enough, this is not good enough, I'm going to start my own thing. So that's why giving you this sort of background is really important, at least to me. Some people might think it's not important. The military that carried out this coup in 1980 and 79 and 80 regarded itself as a guardian of the secularism that came out in the 1920s. So that's something been in Turkish history where the armies always stood up for state secularism, which is nobody should be showing what kind of Islam they're following, and outwardly people should look more Western, and there have always been people who have been against that, right? So because of this 1980 coup, a huge conservative Sunni religious nationalism emerged since the 1980s, which has become really important in Turkish politics. This became associated with what scholars have called the Turkish Islamic synthesis, an attempt to combine Turkish nationalism with Sunni Islam as a source of social cohesion. Cambridge scholarship on this, at least the Cambridge book that I read, I'm sure there are other people who say other things. Islamic scholarship of this whole period explicitly notes that after the 1980 coup, which established a different kind of worldview of Sunni Islam as a counterweight for Western secularism within Turkey, became really important since the 1980s. So after this coup, the new prime minister's name was Turgut Özal, who came to power in 1983, and I hope I said his name correctly. Turkey began moving away from the older state economic model towards more liberalization. People were starting import companies, and Turkey, as we all know, has such a wonderful location. Half of Turkey is actually in Europe and the other half is in Asia, which is the perfect place for any country to liberalize, because at that point they could really cash in on this, and that's what Turkey did. So people began their export oriented capitalism, and there was a huge and very strong culture of private entrepreneurship in Turkey at this time. New business elites emerged because of this. People for the first time had more money that they knew what to do with, and that's going to become important later in the story. And this kind of consumption, which was never seen before in Turkey, came to power, where elites would literally go around with all sorts of elaborate, extravagant things that your mind can take you to, and people own that all over Istanbul. So again, as I say, scholarship of this period says that this kind of liberalization was always had this tension with Islamic mobilization as well. And by the time it was the 1990s, another new element came about, which was an increasingly open conflict between political Islam and Turkey's secular establishment. The Islamic Welfare Party became a major political force, winning all important municipalities in the year 1994 and entered national government before the military pressurized the government out of power in what became known as the 1997 postmodern coup. Turkey, therefore, spent much of this whole decade of the late 90s arguing about whether Turkey as a nation belonged to Islam or did Turkey as a nation belong to quote unquote westernized secular kind of world. How much religiosity was allowed in secular Republic of Turkey, how much of Islam will be tolerated, all these were legitimate concerns of people of Turkey. And it was shortly after this push and pull of traditional Islam and modern secularism that we know that Erdogan came to power, who has been in power since the year 2002, and we are now in 2026 in the month of August, and he's still in power. Anyway, so that was my crash course just to give you where we are situated before we jump into the story of Adnan Oktar. Alright, so I'm sorry, that was a long, boring part of the story. Hopefully, I try to make it as interesting as possible. So now we start with the story of Adnan Oktar, and for a change, rather than talking about Istanbul, we're going to talk about another really important city of Ankara. Fun fact, Istanbul is actually not the capital of Turkey. It's actually Ankara, and Ankara is on the Asian side of Turkey and Istanbul is on the western side of Turkey. So this is exactly the place where Adnan Oktar was born on February 2nd of 1956. And that's where he spent all his life before he basically moved into Turkey. Now, the minute I said that it was February 2nd, I hope, Didi, that you realize that two very unpleasant people that we know were born on this day. Right, so we have two very unpleasant people born on this day. I'm sure everyone else is lovely. Those two women that we know are not very lovely. And then we also have Adnan Oktar, who was also born on February 2nd. But other than these three people, I'm sure everyone else is awesome. Right, so Adnan Oktar was born on February 2nd, 1956. And he was apparently, now this is what, I'll keep saying the word apparently because this man has changed his story about his own family so many times that we actually don't know what the truth is, okay? So in some legal filing, he says one thing and then the prosecutor says something quite different. But let me start here and then we will keep revising his story, I guess. So he was born in 1956 on February 2nd in Ankara. And according to him, he was born into a very, very secular family, which was completely middle class, and he was relatively affluent. Rather than coming from a deeply religious Islamic household, nobody in his family really cared about religion. That's the story that he likes to tell us, okay? So Oktar himself later said that he actually grew up with parents, with a brother, and with grandparents, where nobody in his family regularly prayed. His family didn't even know how to pray. His dad sometimes would go to the mosque on Fridays, and essentially the only person who was even slightly observant in terms of Islam in his family was his grandfather. Now, some Turkish biographies of Adnan Oktar say that his parents were, his father was a man called Yusuf Oktar, and his mother was Madiha Oktar. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But all the biographies say that shortly after his birth, in his childhood itself, his father Yusuf died, and we don't know how he died, or maybe some ailment, we don't know for sure, but he was relatively young at this time. His family placed him in a particular school in Ankara, including he did his secondary schooling in a place called Cebeci, and I'll try to pronounce it, but I'm sure I'm going to get it wrong. It's Quebec. And then he went to a high school to a place which is even more difficult to pronounce, so I will even not try here. What is much more interesting is what seems to be happening around Adnan Oktar when he was in high school. As I said, it was the 1970s and there were lots of political coups going on, military coup, and this was a very volatile time. So he likes to tell all the people that he was not particularly a religious person at all, because he came from such a religious family, such a non-religious, very very secular type of family. So what he did was he himself became slightly interested in religion when he was in high school, and then right, so by his own admission, he was not a very religious person, but by the time he becomes a teenager, is sort of in high school, he begins exploring everything about Islam, and that's where his interest initially began. And by the way, I did say that he grew up in a particular neighborhood in Ankara, where he was very close to to Ankara University's Faculty of Political Science, which is also known as the HACETTEP University. Now, of course, because I don't speak any Turkish, I'm so going to butcher the pronunciation that I'm not even going to try. So, um, and so he was not only close to the Ankara University, but also the other university that I just read out. And he was very close to the Faculty of Law. That's where his house was. And this is where the major street battle between ideas had turned violent many times in the last decade. And that's the kind of environment Adnan Oktar was growing in. He described many times in his writings that he saw a lot of street demonstrations, armed clashes between the Marxists and the right wing people. He also saw bombings. He saw a lot of beatings when he was growing up. He saw a lot of shooting when he was growing up, according to him. So, although this was not within the family unit, it was the larger society around him which apparently shaped the man that he was going to be in the future. And this is the time when he buys a small instructional sort of manual on how to perform daily prayers in Islam, and he starts reading it, and he's little by little starts getting really heavily into religious Islam and readings of Islam in Turkey. He also brought about he also bought a bunch of really interesting other books. I'll mention a few. One is called the Omar Nusuhi Bilman's Catechisms. Another one is called the Al Ghazali Imam Rabbani, which is also a book written by this gentleman. And more importantly, he even bought another book which is Sayyid Nursi Rizale Enur, which is apparently a really important book. Adnan Oktar repeatedly throughout his life keeps saying that Nursi's writings had a profound effect on him, and the combination of all these books began appearing and shaping this person into an intellectual of some sort, where he was trying to look for sort of answers for these things in life. Didi, do you have any observations so far about this person who was growing up? And yeah.
So, what's interesting here is that Oktar was starting to present religion as the answer to what he saw as the problems of materialism, atheism, and political chaos. And this idea would eventually become central to the way he viewed the world.
Yeah, so of course, this becomes really important for him, because whatever happens in your youth, especially the time when you're sort of trying to make like an intellectual identity for yourself, is really important. So, as you rightly said, he's trying to find answers for the larger materialism around him, atheism around him. Of course, he's trying to get away from all this political chaos, as anybody would like to. Unless they want to be politicians, those kind of people thrive on these kind of things. Anyway, so he did not describe himself as someone who has inherited any kind of orthodox religious culture from his family. He instead, likes to tell people that he created this intellectual aura all by himself. We don't know what the truth is, because these kind of people they like to indulge in a lot of revisionist history about themselves, right? So we really don't know, but initially this is what came out about him until the year 1979. Now by the time it's the year 1979, Adnan Oktar was a 23-year-old young man, and that's when he starts his undergraduate degree, and he moves from Ankara, which by the way is the capital of Turkey, to Istanbul. And he starts to study in the Faculty of Architecture and Interior Design. And he did that at a university called the State Academy of Fine Arts in Findikli. And later, this was known as the Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University.
So studying interior design is a very unusual choice at that point of time, right?
It's an unusual choice for a man anyway. I mean, mostly we associate interior design, at least
Right.
now, with women. But at this time, by the way, the interesting thing is that I think more than anything else, he wanted to be close to affluent people,
Right.
affluent women. And had he been doing completely like an architecture course or civil engineering, one would assume it would be full of men and not wouldn't have that much representation of women. I could be completely wrong in the Turkish context, because it became aggressively secular in the 1920s. Actually, the interesting part about Turkey is Turkey gave its women the right to vote much earlier than most European countries did. So at one point, Turkish women would look at European women and think of them as backward. So I could be completely wrong, but the way I see it, I think he knew that this is where he was going to find sort of fodder for himself. He's going to find, like, in Hindi we call them bakras. He basically wanted to find people who would be gullible and he could sort of take advantage of him, of all of them. So that's my reading of it, but I could
No,
be
it makes
completely
sense
wrong.
actually.
But yes, he was not,
Because
yeah, he was not really studying architecture, he was studying interiors. So this young man moves into the university at the age of 23.
right.
Didi, I know you, so you must be thinking 23 is almost 6 years too late for an Indian student, because all of us, most of us start university at 18. Some of us, if you're born later in the year, could even start university at 17, right? At least within the South Asian context, that's what happens. So I think, if I know my sister well, the first thing she would have thought of is this man is starting university 6 years too late. And to that, to quell her, her questions, and maybe the same question emerged in your minds as well, is I found out that you actually have to take extensive examination. So there's a university entrance exam to get into universities in Istanbul, all over Turkey. And then secondly, because there was so much political strife at this point, universities were shut down many times. There were so many strikes all the time that regular education had a lot of disruption at this point. So at least for once, I'm going to say something about Adnan Oktar where I'm taking his side. Right. So, as I said, he was 23. He starts this university, and he explicitly says that he wanted people who were in power. He wanted to be close to people who were elites, and that's probably one of the reasons why he chose interiors over architecture. Anyway, so while this is happening, this man for the first time starts saying a lot of things which are not just plain religious proselytization. He also started believing that a lot of Marxist and left wing people need to be taken care of. Okay, and I put that in quotations because usually that means that he wanted to harm them, or that's what it would mean, but we're not very sure. Okay, at this point we don't know if he was an aggressive man or not. He described his ideas, and most of his ideas were anti-Darwinian, and he was preaching in the corridors and arguing with instructors and professors and other students.
Next year. Why anti-Darwin? Like, what's the context here? He just starts discussing
Right. I think this would be a great place to first, pause and think about this. Why is he being anti-Darwin? Now, for all of us who believe in science, okay, all of us who went to universities and schools and we were taught that, we basically grew from single cell organisms into being human beings. And people who are on the religious side, I'm not saying this is all religions, but it's a dominant strain in some Abrahamic thought where people who are devoutly Christian or people who are devoutly Islamic, I'm not saying everyone, handful of people I'm sure, also think that Darwin was basically lying, and Darwin just made up this theory that we were single cell organisms and then we grew up into being humans. There were apes in the middle, so on and so forth. You know what the story is. But then people like that think that it's a grave disruption of the order that God has created. God created us. In some religions, they say within 7 days, then took rest on a Sunday. That's what the Abrahamic side of life is. That's the thought process. So, such people would say that if we were to endorse Darwin, we would be negating the effect of God, and everything has the hand of God in it. So, that's why being anti Darwin really helps with these kind of people, because they want to say that God did everything. So he was preaching all this in the corridors. He was preaching all this to his professors, by the way, who I would assume are mostly secular people who must be listening to this person thinking that, well, that's a crazy one, or he's being really aggressive with his ideas. But I'm sure for most of it, he just sounded crazy to everyone around him. In his own telling, therefore, he arrived in Istanbul already thinking of himself as some sort of a religious preacher who was on a religious mission in 1983. So that's about 4 years into being in Istanbul. Oktar was reportedly displaying what's called persecutory delusions, where he said explicitly to people around him, to students that he was preaching to, that Freemasons and Jews are out to get him. They're out to get all of Turkey. They're against Islam. And then he basically voluntarily kept saying all this all the time. And his rhetoric over a period of time drew a lot of official attention. And he was arrested and subsequently given a forensic psychiatric assessment. The evaluation by the psychiatric ward basically diagnosed him with paranoia, and he was found not criminally responsible for whatever he was saying.
You just mentioned anti-Masonic. Can you just explain this concept for our listeners?
By the way, I would love to do a whole episode on the Freemasons at some point. I am fascinated by Catholic cults, or any kind of cult for that matter. Freemasons are supposed to be people who are supposedly out there, who control the world. So, if anybody has ever read the Da Vinci Code, a book which sort of was extremely famous in the 2000s, it basically centers around these kind of ideas that there is a Catholic cult that's trying to control the world. Okay, so that's the kind of ideas that he had. That Jews were out to get his country, him particularly. Freemasons were out to get him, so on and so forth. So we see this kind of thought process among many people. Adnan Oktar is just one of them.
So we were discussing about the psychology that he was diagnosed with. So maybe he wasn't simply saying these things because he was irrational. He may have been very calculated at this point of time. That is possible, right? And he understood that if he spoke against strongly, actually against secularism, he could attract people who already felt that Turkey was too secular at a point of time.
I think I completely concur with your assessment. He seems to be the kind of person who was quite calculating, deliberately did not take up architecture, took up, interior design. He says these things over 4 years. Okay, he's building on a certain kind of fringe idea, and people are following him, right? So, and not in too many numbers at this point. He was just trying to influence fellow students, which I always think is such an interesting thing, right? Imagine being a young person walking into university, and like you expect people around you to start following you, you must really think quite highly of yourself if you're that kind of person, right? So in that sense, I do think that he had this kind of inflated ego, right? So anyway, all this kind of rhetoric kept going on, and he started publishing a lot of pamphlets and articles which are anti-Darwinian, anti-Masonic. By the time it's the year 1986, so that was in 1983, so he's doing this in 1984, he's doing this in 1985, he keeps doing this in 1986. His growing boldness and all this culminated in public speeches where he claimed that secularism was a Turkish conspiracy by the elites. um, and then the interesting thing is he's trying to be close to certain elites and he's speaking against certain elites, and the public rhetoric led to his arrest within the same year, which was 1986. And that's when he was forced into another psychiatric assessment. So, Didi, after hearing all this, are you thinking that
I
this
still
man is
believe he's
crazy?
calculated. All his moves are very calculated.
I just found it really interesting. Like, just from a legal point of view, let's say that someone is saying some things which are inflammatory, okay? Um, uh, as someone who is a professor, so I work at a campus, people say all sorts of things all the time, okay? People, especially, okay, I'm going to go after Gen Z a little bit. They say all sorts of outrageous things all the time. But that doesn't mean that nobody, I mean, I don't think anybody's ever thought that let's go and arrest this person. That I found slightly peculiar, that what could have this person said as a 26, 27-year old, which is getting him arrested, and then he's being forced into psychiatric evaluation, forensic psychiatric evaluation. So, anyway, so that's the part that I found really interesting. And I was thinking, what kind of law would even allow the Turkish government to do that to one of its citizens? So I was trying to do that. I tried looking for it. I could not find it, but I still find this so interesting. If there is anyone who's listening who might know a little bit about which Turkish law allows the government to do such a thing, I would love to hear this, because I think all of us are will be so intrigued that any country could do that, right? Anyway, so when they found him, they took him into psychiatric evaluation, and it was concluded that this man, again, they said the same thing, this man has a paranoid disorder, he has a specific kind of paranoia, and he lacked criminal responsibility when he was speaking. Nonetheless, in the year 1987, they put him in psychiatric hold for 10 months. I was saying, Didi, this is so interesting to me that somebody, just for speaking these kind of things, was put into a psychiatric hold. Technically, if you don't believe in secularism in your country, or if you think that an Islamic order should come about, are these really things that make a person crazy? I mean, I was thinking the whole time, and I was saying, well, I was thinking, at the most, whatever this man is saying is inflammatory. If you think about it from the 2026 point of view, where people even believe that earth is flat, that doesn't mean that we put them in jail. So I just found this really interesting. If we have any Turkish audience by any chance, and if somebody knows about this kind of law which can allow the government back in 1987 to put someone in a psychiatric hold for saying these kind of things, that would be something that I would be really interested in knowing. I think all of us would be very curious about something like this. So, Didi, that's where we stand by the end of 1987, where he has been in psychiatric hold for 10 months. And then his official assessment basically says he's mentally unwell. Okay, but I think many people would think that he was politically calculating.
Now, let's put ourselves in this guy's shoes, 26, 27 years old. I mean, it's very difficult for us to think about it. He, it did seem like that he finished his degree. And moreover, I've been thinking about the fact, how was he supporting himself? He claims to have come from a middle class family. And then very clearly, he's got into all these societal tensions. He wants to be closer to elites, dissing elites and closer to elites. So, how is he aligning himself with all these people? How is he making his living at this point of time?
Right, so genuine question. I had the same one. how's this 26, 27? Maybe by this time he was 28. We don't really know about his exact age at this point, but largely what I found was he never finished his degree, but he was supporting himself because he had attached himself to certain rich people. So they were basically bankrolling him. He was living off of their generosity and their charity. And people actually rented a house for him where he was living as well. So by being this religious zealot, he was able to get financial support through his network of upper class people from Istanbul who were sympathetic to his cause and who liked his ideas, and that he spoke so freely about his ideas, and that he was the kind of person who would even go into a psychiatric hold, even go to, let's say, jail for something like his ideas. So I think that's where he was basically kind of like leeching off of people who liked his ideas. So by the mid 1980s, what followed was that he was finding this sense of belonging and purpose in being his kind of Islamic leader. And Oktar presented himself as a guide to young people for these confusing times.
Yeah, because other than this, it doesn't seem like they would benefit of him in any other way. So if you look at his operation, the bigger question here is like, what are they getting from him? Like, why are they willing to follow him, support him? And he seems very extreme at this point of time, right? So this question is bothering me. Why they are offering him a place to stay or sense of belongingness, purpose? So are people struggling with their voices? They are not able to voice themselves in free Turkey, as you've been talking about.
So I think what's interesting is, okay, and this is just my reading, I could be completely wrong, but as a rich person, you have more to lose when you speak up against people in power. All your friends are sort of secular, westernized. So if you start becoming like slightly even more religious, probably things will be frowned upon. You would be frowned upon. So in that sense, they saw him as a conduit where through him they're trying to, speak about their subconscious desire to probably be more religious, but they kind of feel coerced. They have to be secular. They live in Istanbul. It's a very modern, ultra modern kind of place. So most people around in those elite circles could be, like atheists. And probably these kind of people were feeling sort of slightly shameful that they were being like more religious. I can only speculate, not that I am an elite person in 1987 from Istanbul, none of that. So I'm just speculating, but I would think that that would explain why they would be, giving money to such a young man who is just, he's not an Islamic, uh, you know, like, he's not Mahdi in that sense. Mahdi is a very important, Madhi is a very important Islamic scholar, has a deep root in all of Islam. He was not that at this point. So, but I think he's a defender for them in some ways, and they're sort of speaking through him in some ways. So people may be finding a sense of belonging through him. I'm not very sure, I'm just trying to speculate. So upon his release, he starts building a movement in 1988, 1989. He broadens his appeal, and he gathers more and more followers, and as usual, all his followers are young and affluent people. He intensified his anti evolutionary publications, and later on, that became a groundwork for what we can call his magnum opus. He wrote this big ass book, which is called the Atlas of Creation, okay, which apparently is one of the most expensive published books on the planet. And once that book was published, this was in the 2000s, he would freely send it to libraries around the world. And it's an anti-evolution book, so most of the libraries were like, thank you very much, we don't want this book. But it is just so beautiful to look at. Apparently I've seen some pictures of it online, that was his magnum opus. It is a culmination of all his ideas, and he apparently was also working on this book all along. And in most of his publications, he goes under a pseudonym of Harun, Harun. So by the time it's the 1980s, he formed what became the core of his group and core of his identity. um, Although this was still a niche thing, he's not one of those leaders who got millions of followers or anything. However, he solidified his network, and he began appearing on the radar of authorities and religious circles alike. Local publications by the year 1990 knew this person as a widely celebrated niche kind of cult figure among the elite. His followers were, again, as I said, rich people. So I think because of that, he was able to get into media very quickly.
Um, so if we look at those early years, 83 onwards through late 1980s, so Oktar was well known for being against headscarf, or it was just he presented himself as someone who supported Islamic values as extension of religion. Like, what's going on? So what's the main idea and criticism here?
Right. So, and a really interesting thing that Adnan Oktar is known for is that he never explicitly went against anyone. In If they wanted to wear a hijab, he didn't have any opinion about it. To my knowledge, he allowed women to do that, but his whole thing was, because these were already elite, secular, westernized kind of people, most of them were not wearing the hijab, so it was not a big issue for them, to my understanding. However, when we as outsiders look at Islam, we usually think that's the central point in Islam, but actually there are millions of other things. Hijab wearing is just one of the things that all of us from the outside world looking in think that it's important, but at least to Adnan Oktar, it was not important in that sense. If people wanted to wear it, he was not stopping them, but he did not encourage it, I must say that. So by the time it's the 1990s, his group was had a low profile image, and he was building his ideological credibility. However, later on, through the 90s, as television became a really important thing, he becomes a kind of person who had a sort of flashy media persona. By the time it's the late 90s, this man is now in his late 30s. Oh, sorry, he's in his mid 30s.
34-year old. So Oktar is 34 by now. So from the storyline, I don't see any personal growth, as in living off other people. I understand being surrounded by elites, but what about his personal family life? Do we know anything about it? Is he married? Has kids? What's going on there?
Right. So what we do know is that by the time it's the year 1990, he was 34 years old, and by the time it's the early 90s, by the time it's 1993, he's 37 years old. So at this conventional life stage, usual people are usually partnered up or married, but that was not the case according to what we know. He might have hidden children that we have never heard of, but according to what we know, so there is no reliable evidence that has ever come out saying that he had a civil marriage with anyone or established a conventional household with a wife and children, or that he ever pursued a normal profession, because remember, he abandoned university. So is years later, when a legal indictment and a criminal indictment against Adnan Oktar came about, they did say that, interestingly, that in the year 1979, when he moved from Ankara to Istanbul, he actually moved there with his mother and with one of his siblings. There were only two kids in this family, both of them were male. So he did move in with his brother at some point and with his mom, and they were all living in Istanbul at this point. And his brother apparently became a doctor. So his brother is going about doing normal things, being a normal human being. And interesting thing is, when we, as I said earlier on when I was telling you about his family, that we will be revising a few things, because that's the initial thing that came about. He said he was from a secular family. He said that he was relatively affluent. What came out later was that he apparently came from a particular area in Ankara, which is called Dekimeva area. Dekimeva. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. And that just means that most people in that area were in clothing production. So, actually, rather than being an affluent family, probably his mom was a seamstress. And it's come out that his dad was not like this modern, secular office worker or anything like that. His dad was a modern, secular grocer. So he tried to portray himself as a person who was much richer than he actually was. And this sits very awkwardly besides the academic description that he keeps giving himself later on in life. He keeps saying that he comes from a very comfortable middle class background. So anyway, I thought that I will tell you all this when you were asking about his wife and children who don't exist, that the rest of his family was apparently existing besides him in Istanbul, but we're not very sure if he ever moved his family into one of those wealthy places where he was living. So I'm not sure about that. So he definitely did not have a wife and a child. So, though he did not have a wife and a family, he was building sort of like a community around him. And he, by now in the 90s, he was actively recruiting more people to come and live with him, be in his presence. And apparently, he was recruiting richer people, and they were recruiting more rich people, and that's what he was doing. So he was too busy doing other things than to go ahead and get married or do anything. And one of the organizations that he set up would later be known as BAV. And again, these are Turkish words I can't pronounce, but the English translation is Science Research Foundation. That's the one that he established. And sources say that he was trying to pour all his energy into this movement, and he was establishing what we now know is a cult. He was doing all this rather than, indulging in marriage and, making a family. So I hope that answers your question, Didi. Now, interestingly, later on in many of the court cases against him, it's come out that he had several sort of sexual relationships with different women, which is expected. If you start a cult, that's literally part of being a cult leader. You must sleep with all the women in your cult. That's pretty much how cults work. So now, interestingly, the female wing of his organization were all called sisters, and all the male wing organizations were all called brothers. And just to keep people within his organization, he would act as the imam, and he would get people married in a religious ceremony just so that he could keep people there. Now, by the way, I must say that in Turkey, just an Islamic marriage is not really marriage. You have to go and register yourself, and it has to be a registered sort of wedding in the courts. So he's just doing that so that people can just stay with him. And he's also apparently sleeping with a lot of these women, as these cult leaders always do. He's just hoping that nobody leaves him, okay? And they maintain his
Just
cushy
for our
lifestyle.
listeners, both of us are, when I say into cults, we like to discuss about cults. So we have multiple episodes where we've covered about cult leaders, cults. So if you are interested, we'll put down the entire cult playlist in the description box below, and you can go check it out.
Yeah, well said, Didi. So, what we'll do now is we will start moving towards the 2000s. And that's big. By this time, he had crystallized himself into a very well run organization. He was almost like a cult leader. Now, the criminal cases sort of start happening. There are murmurs of people saying that he's up to no good, right? And all those murmurs begin probably in the mid 90s, but they were simply just murmurs. And as I said, male followers are called brothers, female followers are called sisters by this time. And there's this pattern of sexual system where he's getting people married on a paper marriage or Islamic marriage. And he was basically creating a very controlled environment where emotions and romantic ties were being leveraged by these cult members so that they would just be with each other and nobody would basically leave the cult. In a sense, he wanted his cult members to subordinate their personal relationships and group dynamics, and just to just to make sure that Adnan Oktar was at the center. Based on court findings and testimonies years later, it was alleged that all this was very tightly controlled. Those sisters and brothers couldn't leave when they wanted, and he was putting a lot of pressure on people, and he was constantly interfering in their personal life, and he would also discourage people from getting married just so that people could be single for longer and stay in his cult, basically. So around the year 2006 and 2007, Adnan Oktar became famous for something that became the visual spectacle of a lifetime, and which is why so many people know him. He became known for what's are called kittens.
Okay, can I just stop you here? So, was he doing something to animals like kittens? I've been dying to know more about this cult, so just keep giving us all the details. It's getting interesting now.
So the interesting thing is, and this is possibly the second thing that I will say which is nice about him, he, to my knowledge, did not do anything to kittens. Okay. And while I was researching this case, I actually saw a lot of videos of kittens in Istanbul. And by the way, as a country, Turkish people love cats. Cats are everywhere in Turkey. They're literally like these big fat cats which look like gothic figures. They're everywhere, to the extent where people will swerve their cars. There are cats on ATM machines, so you can't withdraw cash until the cat decides to leave. I mean, it's a country that I'm sure people must be so lovely that they're basically inconveniencing themselves every single day just so that they don't inconvenience a kitten. So that probably says something about Turkish people, and I found that so interesting.
Kittens are the women in the cult, like tip top, well made.
In the context of the story, though, thankfully there were no kittens harmed in the making of this cult, right? So it's actually all the women who were surrounding Adnan Oktar who were beautiful women, and they were called kittens. Now, for all those of you who are not looking at us on on YouTube, you probably just hearing us. Let me visually try to describe to you what a kitten would look like. So these kittens were heavily styled women who were always wearing designer wear. Okay, this was Adnan Oktar's public entourage, which would prominently, these women would prominently appear around him in the 2000s. They would all be so glamorous, so beautiful, you couldn't peel your eyes off of these kind of women. And that's the kind of image that he loved to portray, that this was a new kind of Islam, and hence people around the world should join him, especially people in Turkey should join him. And that's why he sort of looked like a very modern figure. Everybody around him is beautiful, men and women alike. Women were typically extremely young women, okay, wore very heavy makeup, extremely glamorous, wore skin tight clothes, I would say, very revealing kind of clothing. And this projected a very polished modern image of a blonde or brunette woman who was just strikingly beautiful, and she was standing right next to Adnan Oktar, and all these women would be sitting right next to him. And by this time, by the way, he even starts his television network, which is called A9 Network. I think he started that in 2010, 2011. But before that, they had a YouTube channel. They had all these things where they would tap into, like they would tap into the limelight by presenting all these beautiful women. And Adnan Oktar, interestingly, always blurred the boundaries between by presenting these women as a spectacle to behold, and these were alluring, modernized Islamic women. And that's why lots of people actually from the outside would see Adnan Oktar and say, you know what, he's so much better than other religious zealots who are constantly putting women in hijabs or constantly making sure that women are completely hidden. And he, on the other hand, is putting women on display. So people in the West actually looked at him in a positive light.
While we are discussing this, to be very honest, he seems like a very charismatic person. So when we are discussing this, he actually seems like a very, carved out personality, so charismatic. He's blending religion with modernity. So you're absolutely right. People will be drawn to such a cult. I mean, when they don't know it's a cult, people are going to be drawn. He's surrounding himself with wealth, media, and everybody fits that certain image: polished, beautiful, rich. So, yeah, who knows what's beneath that veneer, and so many allegations that you've been talking about.
Right. So interestingly, you said the right word. You said we don't know what's beneath the veneer. So now let me take you what was beneath the veneer. So this was a cult-like environment where he lived in beautiful, lavish mansions, extravagant decor. You know, the kind of decor that you usually see, which is full of gold and marble and that kind of stuff. And I mean, unlike Osho, this man did not have like 96 Rolls Royce cars or anything, but he had a mystique around him, which of course comes with a lot of wealth, right? And then additional aura was presented or projected onto this man because of all these beautiful women who were around him, and he was making everything quite attractive. Now, before we go on any further, actually, before I tell you about the murmurs of problems that began around him, just for someone who's interested in sociology, this is actually a well known phenomena which has been written about by one of the founders of sociology, a man by the name of Max Weber. Max Weber interestingly said all this also about Protestant America. He said America became such a prosperous country because under the Protestant ethic, the Protestant religion, faith was important, and if you kept working hard, God would also reward you with a lot of wealth. And the more wealth you had, it was actually one of the ways in which God lets you know that the divine fruits are with you because you're working so hard. God will reward you. In that sense, that's been one of the reasons why America is such an entrepreneurial place. In that sense, if we look at it, Adnan Oktar also echoes something quite similar. He is portraying wealth and beauty and influence as something which is compatible with God's grace. So he's not one of those people who is saying abandon your family and don't go to work. Just think about God all the time and hide in your house. He's not one of those people. So in that sense, he does again seem like someone who is quite, who's quite modern in that sense, right? However, we will come to know that there is some self-serving interpretation of wealth just to prove his legitimacy. He was trying to do that. So, Didi, going back to your question, you were saying, when did the murmurs of all these improprieties basically began with him? And the murmurs started in the early 2000s, around 2011. Former members were leaving his cult and they were speaking out and they were revealing this internal control and manipulation. And by the mid 2010s, Turkish authorities began to scrutinize this group very closely. By the late 2010s, there was a full on investigation going on against this man, not only in Turkey but in other countries as well. And this was basically a decade long period where they were just trying to investigate things against him. Investigations can take a really long time, and they were taking their time. And of course, they were taking their time because by the time they raid his house in Istanbul, they had already submitted to the court a 3,908 page indictment, not only against Adnan Oktar but also 225 other defendants who were all part of his cult. 26 people were formally recognized as the victims of this cult by the year 2018, and 99 people were actual complainants with actual names. There were 23 witnesses who were by this time saying that Adnan Oktar was up to no good. And all this basically means that by the time it's 2018, they bring charges against him for the following things. They bring charges against him for sexual assault, okay, unlawful confinement of people, financial crimes, illegal weapons possession, blackmail, attempted murder, attempted espionage. And by the way, there's a little clip of him. I found it somewhere. I hope I can find it again because I'll try to put it in the video, where literally the first few minutes of the video, I think it's about the first 3 minutes. It's literally just somebody, a court reporter, just reading out his charges, and it takes the court reporter like 3 to 5 minutes just to say all the charges against him. And that's why we know why it's a 3,800 pages just full of the indictments against him. So, his first trial takes place, and where he has to basically talk about all these charges which have been brought against him. And now I will try to tell you stories of different kinds of charges against him and basically tell you what was going on. Okay, what was this criminal organization about? So right, lots of charges are brought against this man, and there were so many charges that I will try to speak about 10 of those charges and tell you about the stories which are related to them. So the first thing is that his whole cult was charged by the Turkish authorities as a wholesale criminal organization. There were so many key players and there were so many names that when I was reading through it, I didn't really think that all the names were quite important. I will just keep telling you, in the absence of names, what was going on. Okay, so the prosecution's basic theory against Adnan Oktar was quite simple. They were saying that one man called Adnan Oktar, he had committed a whole array of offenses, and he himself had created a hierarchical organization where he was on the top and people under him would perform specific functions under his guidance. Oktar was the founder, he was the absolute leader, and people beneath him worked like senior managers. And beneath those senior managers, there were ordinary members who worked as recruiters for other people. So it's basically like an MLM, okay, multi level marketing kind of thing. So when he's giving orders to these people, those people were basically doing all sorts of things. There was a media wing. There were people who were buying houses for him under their names, and they would let him live there. And there was also a branch of this organization slash cult which would lobby ex-judges, politicians. There were people involved in security as well, and there were also men involved in what's the courts in Turkey called the turnstile system.
Okay, before we move on, okay, before we move on, what is this turnstile system? And I've been meaning to ask exactly how did they recruit members?
Right, so the turnstile system, according to the Turkish authorities, was that people of Adnan Oktar's cult, okay, what they would do is they would identify several young, beautiful women, and then a beautiful female recruiter would go up to them. She would approach them. She would say something like, "Oh, I have a modeling assignment for you. I have this commercial opportunity for you." And then in so doing, like if you audition for a modeling organization, they know everything about you. They know about their body, of course, right? They know everything about the families as well. And then slowly but surely, these wealthy women, beautiful women, would take these new girls and boys under their wing, and then the vulnerabilities of these people would be exploited. Wealthy looking men who were under Adnan Oktar, especially a man by the name of Bora, who was a rich person himself. He would manufacture romance with these kind of women, and then they would cross boundaries, and then that kind of intel will be held against these women in this pseudo religious doctrine. These people would be married off sometimes, and then those women would basically then become part of the cult. So that's what they're calling the turnstile system, to my understanding.
This sounds like Ghislaine Maxwell's case.
Yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey. Oh my god, I can't believe I forgot his full name. Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell did something quite similar, right? She was basically like a madam procuring women, little children, basically under the age of 18 for Jeffrey Epstein, and all these women were apparently doing that as well. Not all of them. Some of them were turning this into a cottage industry where they would get more people into the cult. So, however, this does not mean that every single person who was inside this organization was committing sexual offenses. We should be very clear about that. Even the Turkish criminal law is written in such a way that if you're part of an organization and you're at a managerial level, if something happens underneath you, under Article 220, Section 5, even you would be held responsible for that, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? Let's say that you're the principal of a school, and if a teacher does something, you will kind of at least be held responsible as a principal, vice principal. Like they would say, where were you when all this was happening, at least, right? So in that sense, I'm not saying everybody was part of it, but some people definitely were. However, a lot of names have been taken because they were part of this organization, right? So in fact, all this was later taken into the court of cassation, which said that many members had done such things, but not everyone had done such things. Another thing that the court noted about Adnan Oktar is that he presented himself as a Mahdi, and therefore people around him sort of accepted all the interpretations that this man had about religious rules and religious authority.
Who is the Mahdi? Like, okay, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
So, for all of us who might not be familiar with how Islam works, actually, Mahdi is a really important Arabic word, and the exact meaning of this word, according to the dictionary, I mean, I might be getting this wrong. If you know better, please let me know. Is quote unquote a person who will rightly guide you into not only this life but also apparently the next one. It's in Islamic eschatology, Al Mahdi is a future divinely guided leader who's expected to appear near the end of time and restore justice in a corrupt, oppressive sort of world. And on the day of the judgment, Mahdi is apparently very important. The precise doctrine differs between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, but apparently a Mahdi is just important in both these sects, Sunni and Shia Islam. And Adnan Oktar basically was calling himself a Mahdi because that would give him religious authority, and he carefully inculcated this aura of being a Mahdi, somebody who knew everything about Islam and could give his own spin on Islam to you. And this was why he was essentially positioning himself as a divinely guided figure, because that's something that all these cult leaders do, right? They always say things like God speaks to me or God speaks through me, right? So that's roughly what Mahdi means. However, he apparently, of course, misused the word, and he did terrible things with it. But in Islam, Mahdis are people who are very well versed with Islam, and not only very well versed, but also a person or a figure who would appear at the end of times and guide you through the day of judgment. That's my understanding. If I'm wrong, please let me know in the description, in the comments below, please. Now let's come. So the first allegation against him was that he was running a criminal organization. The second allegation, of course, was sexual assault, as it always is against all these cult leaders. They can never keep their hands off of women and children, right? So in the 2022 judgment that came out against him, a few minutes ago I explained what was turnstile recruitment, basically women procuring more women for the cult. That's basically what the court said, that he was sexually exploiting people. The legal issue here was not whether women had physically resisted that encounter themselves. The legal question was, did this organization manufacture a condition where people had to consent to whatever was happening? Those girls had to consent to whatever was happening. So that was also brought under the aegis of the indictment that was brought against this man. And the sexual offenses part is possibly already clear to you. He slept with multiple women. He, on paper, married a lot of women. He called himself a messiah sort of figure. So he was also forcing people within the organization to get married to each other. So we can all see why there would be, assaults, or at least the indictment on sexual assault. So many women, their names have been withheld. Most of the indictment that I read has basically names like CC, BK, DK, words like that. So we really don't know, and frankly it's not our business knowing their names anyway. As long as we know what happened to them and we can give them justice, their names shouldn't matter to us. Their anonymity should be maintained, right? So but there's been a prominent woman, and I'll try to pronounce her name, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me. It's Jaylin Uzgu. I think that's her pronunciation. She joined this cult in the year 2006. She remained in the cult for 10 years, and by the time she escaped in 2017, she has publicly identified herself as one of the people who were victimized by Oktar. And she describes to us in many documentaries that are out there, her public testimony, she says that there were many underage girls in this cult and they were forced to perform for all the men and for Adnan Oktar. So the final legal picture against this man is quite strong. 78 members of the organization were at some point known to be sexually assaulting or doing terrible things to girls and women. And Adnan Oktar himself apparently slept with many consenting adults and also children. So children is anyone under the age of 17 in the Turkish system. But interestingly, the court found that being under 18 doesn't always prevent someone from from consent in some ways, which I found slightly confusing, because in some parts they say if you're under 17 you cannot consent, and in some places they say you could consent to this but not that. That's how the law is written. So it's interesting in that sense. Another charge that was brought against Adnan Oktar was the charge of kidnapping. And by kidnapping we don't really mean that he was nabbing people off of the road in a dark van and throwing people in that. It was just that people who were already in his organization did not have the freedom to sort of leave. So in that sense they couldn't consent to move out of the cult. Okay, they were sort of constrained in that sense.
Deprivation of liberty, unlawful confinement. So that's how.
Yeah, that's the exact legal term, right? So he prevented family members from meeting their own family members who were in the cult. As a matter of fact, if somebody wanted to leave and they would say I'm going to leave, the Turkish word that he would use for them would be munafik. Okay, he would call them hypocritical, he would call them a religious traitor, he would sort of blackmail people, he would have smear campaigns against anyone who was trying to leave, he would put them in a lot of psychological pressure. And that's why there is this charge of kidnapping. Again, I want to make it clear that from whatever I know, he never really nabbed someone off of a street and put them in the car, okay, and grabbed them by the hair or threw them in a jail or something, or a restrained area. But he just did not allow people to leave. And he's been charged with having multiple paper marriages, where he married all these women who were in his organization. He would and then he would force people to get married to each other. I've mentioned that a few times already. So that was also a charge against him. There was also the charge of torment and torture against this person, against many people. And then by the way, the interesting thing is, in Turkish law, torture is not what we colloquially think of as torture. It's usually any kind of ill treatment in Turkish law is considered to be torture. So the court said that Oktar had subjected many members of his cult, particularly women, to physical, psychological violence on remarkably trivial things. Like if there was a telecast going on of his television network, which was called the A9 network, and if some woman would just look away, her eyeballs would dart in a different direction. He would say, oh, you're being disobedient. And then he would sort of sometimes strike them, make other people strike each other. Of course, nobody was openly contradicting this man. But if you would even give the look of dislike on your face, that was reason for tormenting people. So he was one of those people. One of the things that he did to at least one person, we don't know if this happened to many women, but he shaved someone's eyebrows and their hair. as a mark of
No
punishment.
wonder authorities had put him under psych evaluation.
What a cruel thing to do, right? Because your eyebrows, your hair is basically, one's identity in a way. Everything's part of your identity, but especially something so visually, like conspicuous, right? And if some he was just doing all sorts of terrible things, so we should not be, you know surprised that he was taking people's eyebrows away, people's hair away, right? And by the way, he is one of those cult leaders who does have hair of his own, so it was not definitely out of jealousy in that sense. Another
Before we
thing
move
is
on,
that
I would like to clarify a few things. So far, okay, I understand how they were being recruited. So cult works on the ideology and principle where cult leader accumulates enormous wealth, right? So if they are recruiting young kids, of course not nabbing them off the road in the name of modeling assignments, marriage proposals. So how is this cult, you know, gathering so much a people I understand, but wealth? Who's working? How is this wealth coming in? And when even when people are getting married on paper, they are of course having sex. So what about those kids? Are these kids being sent to school? These youngsters who are being brought in the name of modeling assignments, what about their education? So what is happening? Like there's a lot of I need to know all this.
Okay, Didi, all brilliant questions. So let's go back one by one. Number one, you asked me where is the money coming from. A very important question, right? But do you remember that I did tell you that they're all from affluent families? The kind of families where there is so much wealth being accumulated in early liberalized economy of Turkey that they were already affluent. So the women who were under him were actually really some of them were extremely educated, spoke multiple languages. So in that sense, he kept some people just for their money. He kept some people just for their beauty. He was keeping some people for their linguistic abilities. So in that sense, no one's and people were just sort of giving him money. Okay, some people were even giving their estate to him, almost like like charity towards a, an organization that they believed in. Many people do that around the world, right? So, and these were people who had the kind of money where they had multiple properties. So they had properties dedicated to Adnan Oktar. So that's where the money part is, right?
Okay.
If they were
So I got people were giving him estates and money and everything. So is it safe to say that maybe they were record? I remember you previously mentioning that they were they kind of blackmailing these people also at a point of time, or these women, because I can easily understand that not everybody was staying in this cult because they wanted to. Maybe they had some videos, some tapes, some conversations.
So you're actually remarkably you're perceiving this extremely well. Okay, a lot of people have made allegations that they were recorded all the time. And by the way, for all of us who love the Osho movie which came out, it's called Wild Wild Country on Netflix. You remember how that Ma Usha, I don't remember what her name was, right? Yeah, she was sort of recording people and they didn't know, and they were basically bitching against each other within the cult. So one faction was bitching against another faction, and that's pretty much what was happening here as well. So he would record people who were saying something ill about, let's say, another person, or they were saying something ill about Adnan Oktar, and that these people would be blackmailed as well. There were images of, like sort of, which was sexual in nature, which was used as a coercive instrument to keep people in. And then another question that you asked me was, what about those people who were less than 17, 18 years old? What about their education? He was actually remarkably interesting in that sense. He did not allow many women to even get an education. And this is what actually brings me to his charge number 6. So charge number 5, if you remember, let me refresh your recollection. It was the torture charge. We remember when he was taking people's eyebrows and hair away. And a charge number 6 against him by the Turkish courts was obstructing education. Now, this kind of sounds bizarre in some ways, like how do you obstruct someone from getting an education? But he was actually telling people that getting independent knowledge was not allowed in the cult. So he would stop women from going, mostly women, from going to university. because that would also probably give them information by which they would possibly ask about questions against his authority, and then he wouldn't want that. No leader wants that, right? So Adnan disliked formal education, and he would say it out loud, and he was actually using this as a means of coercive control, where he would recruit specific women because they spoke English really well, and that's the language of the elite. And then he would recruit a lot of women because they would speak Russian, because he just wanted this mystique and aura of beautiful, gorgeous, Versace clad, multilinguistic, polyglottic sort of women around him. But those women were like around 10 or 11, and everyone else was devoid of getting an education. So he sort of was playing this really well. And regarding another thing that you just asked me a few seconds ago, that was charge number 7 on his indictment, which was blackmail and secret recording and personal information. So it came out that he was using people's personal data, and he would store it, archive it, he would circulate it, and he was also storing data against politicians and bureaucrats or a journalist who would ever speak to him. And then he would sort of use all that information to sort of blackmail people. There were also websites which were put out against specific women who were speaking out, and he would put those kind of images on pornographic sites as well. He would put images of women, and that's not just him, okay? There's many people who are doing this under him, under his guidance, where they would take the image of a former member, put that on an escort website, and then direct traffic to that person's address and their phone number. So this is like doxing before doxing began, right? So he was doing all sorts of shady things, and that was charge number 6 against him. Right, sorry, 7. Charge number 6 was against education. He was also, of course, when he's doing all this, of course, Didi, he would also be defrauding people of their money laundering, and he was making sure that like all these older people in the organization would just naturally leave all their estate and their money and their property in his name, and he was coercing them to do that, making them think it was his idea, it was their idea, but actually it was his idea. So he was doing all this, okay? The members within the group would have several villas where he would move from one upscale location to the other, not only within Turkey but outside of Turkey as well. And things were in other people's names, so if any illegal thing was done, that would go back to them, not to him. So all cult leaders, this is like 101 of being a cult leader. This is like their basic guide.
Okay, I remember you mentioning about espionage allegations as well. So is blackmailing connected to that, or is it something very different? Like espionage in this case means?
Right. So by the way, his espionage was a genuine espionage allegation in the indictment against him. However, it was at a later appeal, it was taken out. But let me tell you what the espionage allegation was, and this is going to blow your mind, okay? Because this guy, it was about nuclear power plants, okay? So what he was doing was, that's the prosecution's theory. We don't know whether this actually happened or not, but because he was so close to elite members of society, he had knowledge about the AKKUYU. I don't know how to pronounce that, but AKU, nuclear power plant project of Turkey, and its policy, the Turkish policy towards Syria and Syrian intelligence and Turkey and Russia. So he was gathering all this information, and then apparently he was trying to sell this information to outside authorities, or he was leveraging this to put pressure on certain people. So in 2021, the initial court case that came out, it's been said that he directed certain people to establish contact with a man by the name of Jonathan Skizner and Mark Dobowitz, who belong to this foundation, which is called the Foundation of Defense of Democracies in the US. And he was telling people that they need to make sure that there's a meeting between these two gentlemen and Adnan Oktar. And one of the people who were present at this meeting was a beautiful bombshell who was a part of the cult. Her name was Lela Eslimova, and she was acting as the Turkish and the Russian interpreter. And she says that there was some information given out about the nuclear power plants, and that's why he was charged with espionage. However, in a later retrial which happened in 2022, this was overturned, but not because it's false. It was overturned on some sort of procedural issue. So we don't know for sure, okay? This is what it seems like. One of the last things that I'll tell you before I finally shut up is that this man was also charged with illegal political influence, as we can tell. Okay, all these people do that. They always have a politician in the right pocket and in the left pocket, and all their pockets of all the coats that they own. And what he would do is, during Ramadan, they would host these lavish dinners. People would be invited, dignitaries, important people in Turkish society. And then, of course, pictures would be clicked, and those pictures would be used by Adnan Oktar and people in his organization, saying, "Oh, we know this judge, we know this politician," and that would get them to another step somewhere else. So all this sort of political social leverage was being used, basically.
So Adnan seems to be the most powerful cult leader I understand him to be, because he's weaponizing the social wealth.
Just as a side note, by the way, we actually, if you remember, Didi, in the early days of the YouTube channel, we did talk about something called the Manhattan cult. We will put that in the description box. We have also spoken about this Indian cult leader whose name was Asaram. We have also covered another man by the name of Gurmeet Ram Rahim Insan, right? So all these three people have actually done exactly the thing that Adnan Oktar is doing. It's literally almost like all of them attend the same cult academy, and they have like a blueprint that they follow, and it's all terrible people together. Hopefully not everyone born on February 2nd, right? Of course, they all do this. He did that as well, but you put it really well. You called it, he's weaponizing this social capital, and I think they all do it. So last but not the least, of course, it would be he would be incomplete as a cult leader if he would not attempt to murder a few people, right? So just as the cherry on that cake, along with those 10 other things that he did, he also, of course, tried to kill a lot of people who were trying to leave his organization. And in so doing, he also tried to attempt to kill a few police officers as well. So, your garden variety cult leader, he does all of it, okay? He indulges in everything. So last but not the least, one thing I hope I've made it really clear to you is he actually had a lot of educated women here. Let's not always think that only poor people fall for these things or uneducated people fall for these things. As we know, this guy completely targeted just the elite members of society, women who had European degrees, American degrees, okay? People who were the creme de la creme of Turkish society, people who had, attended all great universities, people who spoke English, multiple languages. So his network, his basically spread even more in 2011 because of this television thing. And television is all about spectacle, and he was able to capitalize on all that. So even if we don't follow him, even if we don't like what he was doing, just the women around him were so beautiful that people were basically going out of their way to just see his YouTube channels. So for doing all these terrible things together, Didi, now the final reveal. How many years do you think this person got in for prison?
See, so far I've been very impressed by the way Turkish authorities dealt with him since the early 80s. So I don't want to make a wrong guess. Please tell me it is about hundreds of years. Say that, please.
By the way, my fear was that despite all this evidence, if he gets like 10 years, Turkey is apparently not one of those countries which lets people go for doing terrible things. So I just want you to take a guess. When you said 100 years, okay? A normal human lifespan, even if you're the healthiest person, you would probably go to 110. This man was definitely not running marathons. He was running a cult, right? So he was definitely playing mind games, but definitely not physical games. So let's say, how much, can you take a wild guess of how many years this man would get? Even if you put someone in prison, like when by the time they're 60 or 70, if you put them in jail for 100 years, that's technically enough, right? Because they'll die in jail.
10 lifetimes, 8 lifetimes, because I want it to be true.
I could literally play this game with you for the whole day, where it's like, where you would say, "I raise you another lifetime and yet another lifetime." But I would actually start this game this way, Didi. The lowest threshold is 1,000. You have to start at 1,000 years.
I am so proud of Turkey. I'm so proud of them.
So okay, it's actually 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. Okay, and you're very proud of Turkey for that. We are too. Okay, somebody needs to deal with these criminal organizations. Turkey gave him an accumulated sentence, a confirmed sentence of 8,463 years. Now, of course, nobody is alive for 8,463 years, but I think visually it's important for all of us. Psychologically, it's important for all of us to see justice being delivered somewhere, at least on the planet, right? So it gives us immense satisfaction that he's been put in jail for 8,463 years. He's in a high security prison. And when men like this go to prison, they of course don't stop being cult leaders the next day. He tried to do this even to other prisoners as well, where he's giving them sermons, he's not letting them sleep, he is telling them that he is a Mahdi. He's doing all this, and of course, all the prisoners want to beat the crap out of him, right? So, but he's trying to be a cult leader inside the prison system as well. His prison is called the Van High Security Prison in Eastern Turkey. When I heard Van High, it sounds more like a high school than a prison. But yeah, anyway, so that is, hopefully now I get to shut up and you will now listen to Sam tell us about her psychological insights of this whole saga, because I've gone on and on for I think about 3 hours now. So yeah, so Sam, now explain how a person like Adnan Oktar is even possible psychologically.
Uh, do you remember we discussed something very similar previously also, where from the psychological point of view, all these cult leaders work by creating strong sense of dependence. So in his case, it's beauty, it's money, it's control. So people here gradually became separated from their friends, family, or support system that they had, and they started depending almost entirely on him and the group. So in Oktar's case, this was also strengthened by fear, control, and belief, as you mentioned the word Mahdi. So, and believe that he was someone who had special knowledge and authority. Plus, the mind games he had been playing, the charisma he was using, recordings he was doing. So, it is very important for us to understand that they don't, such cult leaders don't simply attract people because they are weak or irrational. And you've made it very clear from the beginning that women in the cult and people were very educated. They had international degrees, they were polyglots. So they were not fickle minded, they were not weak. But there was something about him that appealed to them in their day to day life.
Right now, Didi, why don't you tell us a little about the bite model, which we know has been pioneered by a man by the name of Stephen Hassan, who is a person who at one point was actually in the Moonies cult himself. He was able to leave that cult, and since then he has had he acquired a PhD in the 1970s, and he is the world's leader in how to decultify yourself, okay, how to get out of that kind of mind control. So I hope, Didi, you will be able to explain the bite model to us, because that's going to be such an important thing for all the listeners and viewers. If you can just keep this in mind and someone is doing that to you, hopefully you will be able to get out of that situation before someone even tries.
Okay, so before we move on, BITE, it stands for behavior, I stands for information, T stands for thought, and E stands for emotional control. So, in very simple terms, it looks at four ways a group can control its followers. So, first is behavior control. So, you control people, you control their mind, and you basically, for example, so what they wear, what they do, the kind of makeup bunnies were supposed to have, the relationships they were into or they would inculcate in future, and how they spend time. So behavior control. Then information control. So basically he was limiting people when it comes to so what they hear from outside, what they see. They were not allowed regular education, they were not going to universities. So in his case, his own media platforms were creating an environment where followers were mainly exposed to all these version of events. Then came thought control. So it was all about influencing how people think, what they accept as truth. So Oktar presented himself as someone with special religious authority, which could make his followers trust all the views he had and their own judgment. And you remember initially we were discussing, like I asked a question, why were people following him, or why were these rich, educated following a middle-aged man, young man actually, not middle-aged at that. So moving on, finally, there is this emotional control, and this involves affection, this involves praise, and also it involves fear and threats on the others. So you just explained it to us because they had recordings, they had material that was being recorded on a regular basis. So there you go about emotional control. So the important point is that control does not usually happen in one way. There are multiple ways: behavior, information, thoughts, emotions. Everything is being influenced at the same time. So you're basically being attacked from all the sides. And gradually, your independence, your thought, everything starts becoming weaker. This is your BITE model.
All right. So, okay, last but not the least, and this is where we always end all our episodes, we try to understand criminologically how something like Adnan or psychologically, Sam has already explained to us what's the psychology of a person who will try to control you. How do you make sure that these kind of people don't control you through the bite model? But criminologically, what Adnan Oktar was doing to people in his cult is basically can be very easily understood by the social bond theory, which is by a man by the name of Travis Hershey. Now, Travis Hershey basically says that as a society, we thrive with attachment, commitment, involvement with each other, we believe in each other, and that's what cults do. They basically exploit a weakened social bond. So when students leave their homes, they go to university and they're looking for that new network of people. That's where people are most vulnerable, and cults usually pounce on people like at that time. So that's what Adnan Oktar did. He was trying to proselytize people around him, right? And then he was trying to recruit all those people into his cult. Another thing that he did was basically he was trying to replace their social bonds with the society that he was bringing about. And people were actually more attracted to him because they kind of felt like, though I'm not with my family, this is my new family, people are looking out for me, so on and so forth. So this kind of fostering sort of brings blind zeal together, dependence on each other, and it makes this sort of cult bond not feel like a cult, it makes it feel like a family that really cares for you. So that's one way to understand how people like Adnan Oktar are able to thrive in by making a cult. Another way to probably explain this would be differential association theory. Now, usually differential association theory is used in terms of children. Differential association theory basically says something like, if I'm growing up and let's say my aunt is a known criminal and I meet my aunt every single day, there are chances that I'm going to be like my aunt as well. I will probably become a criminal as well. However, if that aunt was living in another country or another state and I hardly ever meet her, my chances of becoming a criminal leader would be very less, not because of her, right? So that's usually how differential association works, okay? But actually differential association also works really well when it comes to cults. Usually people who join cults knowingly, or at some point they just want to be part of a group, are usually adults, right? And actually, this theory helps us explain that criminal attitudes and behaviors can be learned at any age. Women were trying to recruit younger women for Adnan Oktar, and they were being told time and time again, it was being reinforced to them that this is okay, this is permissible. If a Mahdi is saying that you can do it, then you can do it, right? So you are, as a person in a cult, if you're being told time and time again, it's been reinforced to you that all the things that the cult is doing is absolutely perfectly legal, then your immunity for the outside world, will be very different. Anyway, so we're going to stop this insanely long episode here. Okay, I hope that you appreciate the length and breadth of the research that went into this. And if you're happy with this episode, we hope that you're going to like this video and you're going to share it. Okay, and we would love to hear your comments. If there's any cult that you would want us to look into, and if you just drop us a name and we will look into it. And I guess that's the end of this insanely long episode. Okay, I'm literally losing my voice now. So until we see you again, stay collectively vigilant.